I'll begin with some introductions. Welcome, everybody. My name is Simon Nicholson. I'm director of the Institute for Carbon Removal, Law and Policy at American University in Washington, D.C. Welcome to one of our semi-regular webinars on all things carbon removal. This webinar is going to be recorded and captioned and will be posted on our website, carbonremoval.info, where you can find prior webinars in the series and a whole host of other resources. The webinar today is on a report that was released last year titled A Research Strategy for Ocean-Based CDR and Sequestration. This report was prepared by a panel established by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. These kinds of consensus study reports are meant to convey the state of scientific knowledge in a complex area, and also to provide, importantly, recommendations, particularly to the US federal government and to other actors. We have three speakers with us today to help us unpack the report and to understand its impact and importance. First is Scott Doney. Scott is John D. and Helen J. Kington Professor in Environmental Change at the University of Virginia. Scott was chair of the study panel. Welcome, Scott.
Hi.
Emily Cox is a research associate at the University of Oxford, where she works on carbon removal. Welcome, Emily. And Will Burns is visiting professor in the Environmental Policy and Culture program at Northwestern University, also founding co-director of the Institute for Carbon Removal, Law and Policy. Welcome home, Will.
Thanks, Simon.
Great. So we're going to begin with Scott. 10 minutes or so, Scott, for an overview of the report.
Okay. Thanks so much, Simon. So as Simon mentioned, I was chair of the committee put together by the National Academies to look at ocean-based carbon dioxide removal and sequestration. And the rationale for why this report was needed at this time, in part, it's because carbon dioxide removal is being discussed as part of a lot of the climate mitigation scenarios. Many of you have probably heard of the Paris Climate Agreement, with the goal of keeping anthropogenic warming of the planet to less than plus 2 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels, and if possible, down to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We've already eaten up about 1.1 degrees Celsius warming from the pre-industrial level. And a lot of that warming can be tied into carbon dioxide emissions to the atmosphere, where carbon dioxide has a very long lifetime. About half of the carbon dioxide we emit stays in the atmosphere. The other half is taken up by natural sinks. And the idea is, could we accelerate some of those natural sinks or develop independent technological sinks that would augment the natural sinks and draw down atmospheric CO2? And so many of these scenarios require, in order to meet the climate goals, that carbon dioxide emissions by humans reach a net zero sometime by mid-century. So that would be some aspects of things that are difficult to mitigate or abate, long distance ship transportation, long distance air travel, aspects of the agricultural systems, where it's just really hard to get those greenhouse gas and carbon dioxide emissions down to zero, could be balanced by net uptake through various biological and technological approaches. So to frame this, human emissions right now are roughly about 35 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. The ocean already takes up roughly about 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide through natural processes, mostly related to physical chemical dissolution of carbon dioxide, the gas, into the surface ocean, and then subsequent ocean circulation that takes those surface waters down into the deep sea. So one approach that has been suggested is, or one avenue of approaches, are geochemical. They would be, for example, increasing ocean alkalinity that would act to increase that natural rate of carbon dioxide uptake. The other set of approaches are primarily more biological and have to do with the idea that right now, photosynthesis by phytoplankton in the surface ocean removes a lot of CO2 or carbon dioxide from the surface ocean. Some of that carbon gets made into organic matter that sinks into the deep sea. So there's a natural biological carbon pump that lowers the amount of carbon dioxide in the surface ocean and atmosphere and increases storage in the deep sea. So various approaches have been proposed that, for example, nutrient fertilization that would stimulate more phytoplankton growth, seaweed aquaculture, where you would grow macroalgae either offshore or inshore, but then transport that macroalgae and then let it sink or deliberately sink it to the deep sea as a way of storing carbon. Artificial upwelling, which would bring nutrients up from below and stimulate phytoplankton growth. And also ecosystem restoration. We know that a lot of marine ecosystems have been heavily degraded in the past by overfishing, by whaling, by coastal habitat destruction. And the goal would be to, as part of these restoration efforts, understand how much carbon is being sequestered in the ocean as these ecosystems recover. And then finally, another technological approach that's related to the alkalinity approach would be to electrochemically split water and use the products of that splitting to actually extract CO2 out of seawater and store it in some geologic reservoirs. So this is linked into more land-based approaches where the storage wouldn't be in the ocean. It would actually be in, old oil and gas reservoirs, under salt domes, things like that. So the committee looked at various aspects of these 6 technologies: the electrochemicals, water splitting, and alkalinity enhancement as the 2 abiotic approaches, and then the 4 biotic approaches. For each of them, we looked at things like the knowledge base, what is currently known, where could a research and development strategy amplify our knowledge about things like the efficacy. Will these approaches actually work to remove carbon from the atmosphere? For how long? Sometimes it's called the permanence or durability of the sequestration. And then what are the costs, the potential for scale up, the environmental and social impacts of these approaches? I want to highlight that all of these approaches have some amount of intended environmental impact. They are all going to alter the ocean, either by changing the ocean chemistry, changing the ocean biota. None of them are completely benign. Now, we may decide that those environmental impacts are small enough that the overall benefit of the carbon sequestration is worthwhile, but it's worth keeping that in context. So we went through each of those 6 technologies. Those were the technologies or approaches that were in our statement of charge. We developed a detailed assessment for each of those, and I encourage anyone who's interested. The pre-publication version of the report is available on the web, and you can download it electronically as a PDF for free, and hopefully the printed final copies will be available in the next few weeks. In terms of summary of what we found, we felt that a research and development strategy is necessary because these approaches are being discussed and will likely be pursued by various actors, whether those are in the corporate or entrepreneurial space or in the governmental space, that we don't have sufficient understanding right now, in particular things like the efficacy and the environmental and social impacts of these techniques need to be quantified in much more detail to provide a robust information base for society to move forward. Included in the research and development tasks was, in addition to sort of natural science, going out and doing experiments and doing monitoring and verification of CO2 storage and environmental impacts, we also suggested a substantial investment in social sciences. Everything from public perceptions of these technologies to the legal and regulatory and governance issues surrounding these often very complex technologies that will affect not just the location where, for example, if you were to add iron to stimulate phytoplankton growth, you're going to have effects there, but also could have downstream effects that might extend beyond a country's exclusive economic zone into the open oceans or affect transboundary issues. And so within the report, at the very end, we come up with a proposal for a sort of decadal research plan that would be adaptive. It would include this sort of foundational research on social and legal and governance issues, the development of a research code of conduct that should be upheld by all researchers, both funded by private and public entities, and that would be open and transparent so that the public is engaged from the beginning prior to the deployment and development of these technologies. And then also adaptive research and development in the sense that we may learn about new technologies that we want to invest in. We may decide that some technologies are just not going to work out, and we would want to reduce or eliminate funding for those streams. And that at some point on sort of the decadal frame, we would want to decide whether or not to pursue these technologies. The report is not an endorsement of ocean-based carbon dioxide removal, but it's a recognition that we don't have sufficient information for the public and for policymakers right now to decide either for or against any of these technologies. So I'll stop there and hand it over to Will, who's going to talk more about some of the legal aspects of these ocean-based approaches.
Thank you very much, Scott. As Scott emphasized at the outset, I think one of the laudable aspects of this report is the coverage, the extensive coverage of both legal and social justice oriented issues, far more than some of the past reports from the academies in terms of either carbon removal or solar radiation management, geoengineering. And so I just want to briefly outline some of the legal aspects and findings in the report. So first of all, the report notes that it's important to establish a quote unquote clear and consistent framework to govern ocean CDR research and potential deployment, while cautioning that it's important not to impose quote overly strict requirements. And I would be in agreement with that, though. Of course, the devil is always in the details. But it's laudable that that people are starting to think about how to effectuate that balance in a way that can foster research, but protect against some of the risks that are outlined in the report. The report notes next that there are several principles of customary international law that might be pertinent to ocean CDR research. Probably the most important is the so-called no harm rule, which is an obligation for a state to ensure that activities within its boundaries or control does not inflict serious harm in the global commons or in other nations' jurisdictions. The report indicates that that this isn't an absolute requirement to not cause harm, but it requires due diligence, i.e. Maximizing one's efforts to reduce those potential harms. It also suggests that there may be a need for additional national legislation to help operationalize those principles. And I think that's a critical finding in the report, and it's probably something that needs to be done sooner rather than later. If you look at the United States' national legislation, for example, including the Marine Protection, Research, and Sanctuaries Act, which would regulate dumping of materials in U.S. waters, it's unclear really how some of these provisions would be applied in the context of either research or deployment of these approaches. And given the fact that a lot of this activity is now starting to ensue, it would be helpful if agencies started providing some guidance in terms of what applications for permits should look like and what they should include. And given the fact that we now have a carbon negative Earthshot that calls for all hands on deck, agencies on the legal side should be mobilizing as quickly, in my opinion, as some of them are in terms of the scientific aspects of carbon removal. And I've yet to see that. Another important customary principle that's pointed out in the report is environmental impact assessment, right? And given the fact that many of these approaches, as Scott suggested, might have impact in the global commons or in other countries' jurisdictions, transboundary environmental impact assessment is important. The International Court of Justice has provided that states are required to do that under customary international law, where there may be transboundary impacts, but largely leave it to the states to determine the contours of that and don't provide for a veto of those activities by other states. However, interestingly enough, under the law of the Sea Convention, the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction treaty that is being developed has special interest in the role of transboundary environmental impact assessment and is discussing various potential proposals, including requiring third-party scrutiny of environmental impact assessments or potentially even a form of veto by those that might be potentially affected. And how those issues are ultimately decided may be extremely important for some of these approaches that contemplate either coastal deployment that has impacts beyond those borders or in the open oceans. The report also affirms the important principle that the Paris Agreement most likely would allow parties to include carbon dioxide removal, including ocean carbon dioxide removal, within their nationally determined contributions. The report did not address what I think is another important issue, which is the role of Article 6 mechanisms, including the potential role of market-based mechanisms to engender collaboration, which may be pertinent for some of these ocean-based approaches, as well as the non-market-based approaches, which might facilitate technology transfer, which could be critical to scaling these up in the long term. But as the report suggests, a lot of these rules are ultimately going to have to be developed under the rubric, presumably, of the Paris Rulebook, including accounting procedures for claiming these credits, and a critical issue, especially for ocean-based approaches, monitoring, reporting, and verification, which is proving extremely challenging for some of the startup companies that are now looking at these issues. The report then noted the intervention of the Convention on Biological Diversity to date. The CBD has established a number of resolutions that seek to restrict geoengineering, which they define very broadly, to small scale science-based approaches with no commercial motivation for those activities and subject to risk assessment. As the report suggests, that has some limitations. The resolutions are not legally binding on the parties, and a lot of the language is pretty hortatory. Also, it should be emphasized that one of the maybe the most key players in terms of ocean CDR in the future, the United States, is not a party to the CBD, which obviously limits its purview quite a bit. The report then addresses the Law of the Sea Convention, which obviously could have a large role, given the fact that it provides for both privileging research in the world's oceans, but also establishing potential liability if research were to create harm beyond one's jurisdiction. It also, the report notes that some of these activities, including dumping things like olivine, for example, or iron, could constitute pollution under the convention, and there could be potential liability for those harms. Though interestingly enough, some have argued that CO2 is also a pollutant, and to that extent, it could be argued that these approaches are actually a means of addressing pollution. And so it's an interesting trade-off that we may see in the future, and maybe an inevitable trade-off given where we are. The London Convention is addressed next. This convention has probably been the most active in the context of ocean-based approaches. The London Convention passed a resolution in 2008, essentially did the same thing as the CBD. It said that the good news for those engaged in ocean iron fertilization, and that was what they were focused on, was that this activity could fall within exception to the dumping provisions of the convention, because it was for placement for purposes other than mere disposal, right? But you can only take that exception if you're not contravening the rest of the provisions of the treaty. And it said to do so, it had to be small scale, no commercial credits from it, and again, risk assessment. As the report points out, a party under at least the London Convention could potentially instead say, we are engaged in dumping, and seek a permit to do so. And the analysis suggests that at least under the convention, given what what materials are specifically excluded. Most of the materials that might be used in these approaches would be permitted, and so a permit could potentially be developed. But again, establishing the contours of that haven't occurred yet. The London Protocol, which is supposed to supplant the convention, has passed an actual amendment to the treaty, which would be legally binding on all the parties, as opposed to a resolution. It is limited at this point to ocean iron fertilization, but contemplates other marine approaches could be regulated in the future. So that could be very significant. On the other hand, the U.S. is not a party to the protocol. So again, a key player is not in the mix. And second of all, it's going to require 2/3 of the parties to accept it before it comes into force. And at this point, only, I believe, 6 parties, 6 or 7, have accepted it. So it has a long way to go. In terms of the international approaches, NAS finally suggested there be other treaties that might be involved. The Environmental Modification Convention, EDMOD, established after the Vietnam War, as well as the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. And I think I would add there's probably others. There's probably the regional seas programs that might also be involved, the fish stocks agreement and so forth. And so one challenge we'll have in the future is if we see a world of polycentric governance of these approaches, will that prove unwieldy, or will it prove beneficial with individual regimes addressing concerns that they have expertise in, and no one knows. And then finally, there's an extensive discussion of domestic approaches in this treaty, and they use the U.S. as a case study. And I think 2 interesting points of this is the laws that are applicable are dependent where the activity takes place. If it takes place very close to the coast, for example, as in enhanced coastal mineral othering, for example, you may have local, state, national, and to some extent international provisions applying. Others, if it were in the open ocean, just with U.S. vessels or vessels of another country, a different approach. And also, what laws will apply is going to be based on the nature of the activity. Some of these, such as ocean enhanced alkalization, might include beyond aquatic-based regulations, might include things such as mining for the materials that are involved, maybe even things like the Clean Air Act, if there's environmental implications associated with inhalation of those kind of materials. And so again, a multiplicity of potential regimes, and probably, given how long it'll take to stitch all those together, we probably should be thinking about that sooner rather than later. And I think the Academy's call for a research program is a clarion call to make sure that those things happen in parallel with the scientific research. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. Before we move to Emily, just a quick clarifying question for you, Will. Can you say again under which international treaty or agreement the use of a material like olivine could be considered pollution of coastal areas or pollution of the seas?
Yeah. Certainly, I think under the London Convention, right, it talks about the introduction of any material or energy that potentially would have a deleterious impact to ocean ecosystems or human health. And to the extent that people argue that it could release heavy metals, for example, or alter the biogeochemistry in some of these environments, I think it could constitute a pollutant. Ditto with iron, right? If it created anoxic conditions or nutrient robbing, as Scott had suggested, I think that would fall into the purview of UNCLOS. Also would fall into purview, I think, of the London Convention, CBD. In terms of harms to organisms, CAMLAR, there's a lot of those regimes that talk about that.
Thanks. So that was a question from the audience, that clarifying question. We invite other audience questions using the Q&A function. Please start submitting them when you're ready. Over to Emily.
Great, thanks ever so much. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to participate in this really important session. So my name's Emily. I'm joining from Bristol in the UK. It's a really lovely spring evening here. And I'm going to talk about the social considerations in the report, and particularly these sections on public attitudes, public participation, and justice. And so I should point out that I wasn't actually involved in the writing of the report, so I can kind of comment on the report itself, but not the process of producing it. And obviously, I'm probably not as familiar with it as the people who actually wrote it. So we'll go through some of the key points which the report makes, and I'll append some of these with my own thoughts. And then at the end, I'll make some kind of more general comments. So what does the report say about social considerations? So firstly, they point out that this is about so much more than just public acceptance, that we need to research social considerations if ocean carbon removal is to be effective and just. And they also point out that the research on this is barely existent, right? And I couldn't agree more with all of those points. And we know that it's extremely challenging researching things like public attitudes for highly novel techniques. There are deep methodological challenges. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing this research. It's not a case of like getting the technologies right first. The two have to go hand in hand. And as in any other field, methodological challenges can be addressed through a kind of robust and ongoing scientific process. Understanding social impacts early on has a lot of different uses, and amongst other things, it can help us to avoid locking into unsustainable patterns of innovation. And it's also worth just emphasising that social considerations aren't just risks, as they're sometimes framed. I often hear this phrase like social risks. Publics aren't just a barrier, they're not just an obstacle, they can also be really important enablers of innovations and policy. And the report notes that marine activities are not necessarily more acceptable than terrestrial. And this is a really important point, right? There's often a bit of a lazy assumption that there's some sort of clear binary between terrestrial and offshore is somehow easier when it comes to public, right? Of course, it's not as simple as this. A lot of it has to do more with kind of place fit than whether it's offshore versus onshore. And we've seen this clearly with other things such as carbon capture and storage and wind power. And I think on this point, it's important to emphasize that there are challenges in defining what we mean by affected communities. We often talk about affected communities, but these aren't always just place-based. And the information environment that we've got means more people are now defining their community online, and we see these kind of spatially dispersed communities of interest emerging around new projects and new technologies. And the report discusses the perceived risks of marine carbon removal. It draws on some work that we did on risk perceptions, and I think it's really important to emphasize that there are some aspects of the ocean context which could be subject to heightened public risk perceptions. So in particular, the oceans are seen as very interconnected and open environments. This has implications for the controllability and the reversibility of impact, and obviously monitoring, which has already been mentioned. And this is quite an important predictor of people's risk perception. And overall work that we've done kind of shows that oceans are particularly vulnerable to risk perceptions relating to scientific hubris and uncertainty, and about trust in our ability to regulate and govern effectively in this environment. In addition, the oceans are often perceived as pristine and fragile and in need of protection. And so we've done some work recently, which is currently undergoing peer review, and it finds that interaction with what we're calling iconic environments, which includes the ocean, tends to lead to heightened emotions and to heightened risk perceptions. And it's important to point out, though, that all of this stuff is culturally specific, right? And so these findings stem from work that we've done in Western nations, in industrialized contexts. We don't know very much about the cultural interplay in other areas, and so we really, really need more research on that. The report points out that attitudes could be influenced by perceptions of naturalness, and of course this is really important when we're thinking about all of these very different carbon removal techniques. So we've got multiple studies using all different methodologies demonstrating that whether or not something's perceived as tampering with nature is a really important predictor of support for new technologies, and particularly for carbon removal. However, we also know that nature as a concept is extremely fluid. It's dynamic, And neither scientists nor publics really have a full definition of what it means for something to be natural. And so this fluidity means that the terms often used quite deliberately to imply that a particular technique is more benign. And so because of this, to try and get a little bit more scientifically robust, the field of research is arguing that we need to move beyond this kind of binary of nature-based versus engineered approaches. And indeed, the IPCC Working Group 3 report uses a much broader taxonomy of approaches according to the capture mechanism and according to the storage location. The report's got a really good section on environmental justice, which I love because it's so important in this field. And they point out that environmental justice is multifaceted. Justice implications will be influenced by which techniques are deployed, how they're deployed, and the policies which support them. So this I would kind of add another crucial point, which is it's also about what drives the motivation for deployment, and particularly who benefits and who loses. So what is carbon removal actually for? What role does it play, both in terms of our overall efforts to address climate change and its role in societies and communities? And for example, something which is discussed less in the literature is the interplay between carbon removal and adaptation. And many of these coastal techniques could interact with climate adaptation, particularly for communities vulnerable to climate change impacts. And so there needs to be more research on this, I would argue. So just in terms of my kind of general responses to the report, I mean, firstly, the fact that this dedicates basically an entire chapter to social considerations is a real testament to the work of the social scientists who were involved. It really shows how far we've come, right? Because not very long ago, social science was like at best a fringe consideration in carbon removal research. And all too often, I still hear arguments that these are like irrelevant or secondary to the main kind of technical considerations. And this viewpoint's clearly changing. The authors have done a wonderful job in ensuring the public aren't forgotten about here. But the next step is more challenging because it concerns how we respond to these public concerns. Often the kind of default response seems to be, oh, well, publics are uninformed, so we need to educate them so that they think more like we do. And that view is kind of still depressingly prevalent, especially outside of academia. And so when we're funding research into social considerations, we need to think about the resulting recommendations and outcomes. In particular, we need to avoid falling into the trap of like subjugating social intelligence, so what people can actually teach us, to the technical and economic considerations. And we obviously need to avoid the trap of like wanting to educate our way around very real social risks. And we need to be aware, most of all, that this is a highly contested space with existing power relations. And the word power is often a little bit missing in research on novel innovations. So, for example, I really like the idea of the showstoppers that are mentioned in the report. So this is where, for example, technological or societal viability is so low for a particular technique or a particular context that we just don't carry out any more research investments in this area. And this is similar to something that's been done in the UK called a stage gate approach. But the question is obviously who defines these showstoppers? How do we ensure that the definition and enactment of these showstoppers doesn't simply retrench existing power dynamics? So the report makes some really excellent points about inclusion and equality and diversity, but we need to recognise the way in which resources and capacity are really skewed towards existing elites, including away from global south actors and away from public. And so just to kind of wrap up, so I love the fact that societal issues are given due consideration in this report, but it's also worth pointing out how low the proposed funding is compared to a lot of the technical research agendas. So Overland and Somercourt point out that 0.12% of climate research funding has been spent on the social science of climate change. It's 0.12%, right? And similarly, there's a real risk that when we're carrying out this research, the inclusion is kind of seen as a box-ticking exercise or is just generally under-resourced. We need to remove barriers to participation, The report details some of the ongoing efforts for co-production, but there are crucial capacity issues which are slightly less well covered in the report. Because true inclusion requires capacity building, which requires probably more resources than the funding recommended, and especially because these resources are based on historical experiences which are overwhelmingly not paying due attention to capacity building amongst historically disenfranchised societies and communities. So yeah, I'll wrap up. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Emily. Fabulous. Scott, did you want to respond to any of that?
No, I did want to, if it's okay, I was just going to share a slide that has the QR code. So if people want to go and download the report, that's okay. Actually, you guys have disabled that. So, okay, let me try that again. So yeah, wonderful comments by both Will and Emily. And, part of the challenge on both of the aspects they touched on, the legal, the governance, the social, was the dearth of information in the peer-reviewed literature. And so, one of the interesting things about these Academy consensus reports is we did bring in many scholars to talk with us, and we use our own judgment and experience, but we really try to tap into the literature. And you quickly find that for some of these topics, there just isn't a lot of material, and that was in part the rationale for, well, we need to invest in these areas. So I just put up, if hopefully you can see it, the QR code with the cute little dinosaur, or you can just go over to the National Academy Press website. It's pretty easy to find.
Thanks, Scott. I wonder if you could say a little more about how the report is landing, how it's being received, and what the committee is hoping for in terms of reception.
Well, so what's interesting is this report was actually, Academy reports come into being, or Academy committees in different forms. This was actually funded by an NGO. So it didn't have a congressional mandate, and it wasn't funded by a federal agency or agencies. I'd say there's been a fair bit of interest from civil society and NGOs. We've been doing a lot of webinars and briefings. We've done briefings for various federal agencies within the U.S. And we're going to do some more stuff. Now I can't remember. We've got a few more events coming up in May. So I'd say, there's a lot of interest. There's been a lot of movement on the entrepreneurial and private space, with a number of companies announcing rather large investments, on the order of 900 million over the next decade for various forms of carbon dioxide removal, some of which could be ocean-based. XPRIZE is moving forward on picking, awarding teams for carbon dioxide removal, and some of those are ocean-based approaches. So I'd say, we're probably, it was good that we got the report done when we did, because there's already been a lot of movement in the 4 or 5 months since we've released this. There have been other groups that have been looking at this as well. Ocean Visions, which is a blend of researchers and entrepreneurs, has put out a series of roadmaps of how they think we should move forward on ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. The Aspen Institute wrote a nice report on the elements of a research code of conduct that sort of mirrored some of the discussion that was in the Academy report. So there are many other resources, and then of course the IPCC Working Group 3 report that came out 2 weeks ago, which of course we didn't have access to, but many of the themes in the carbon dioxide removal section in that report are similar to what we had in the Academy's report.
Thank you.
So I'll take the slide down now. You've probably seen enough of it, but yeah, please, it's freely available as a PDF on the Academy Press website.
Thanks. Emily, I saw you unmute there. Did you want to jump in?
Oh yeah, no, I was just going to add to what Scott was saying about the code of conduct, because we're working on something similar for the EU with an organisation called South Pole, which is basically doing this. It's not for marine carbon removal, it's for like carbon removal in general, but particularly it's focusing on this, this voluntary space that's really emerging, and these kind of, potential voluntary markets that might start springing up. And so, yeah, trying to develop ways of doing that in a really robust way. I've heard it called the Wild West at the moment.
I'm just looking at the questions that are coming in. Scott, unless you wanted to respond there again.
Well, I just want to say, one of the things, and this goes to Emily's, I mean, there have been experiences with, some of these technologies could potentially be used for or promoted for other uses. So for example, iron fertilization has been promoted as part of ecosystem restoration to rebuild fisheries. And there have been some controversial projects where many people felt the projects lacked the robust scientific framing. And in particular, and I think Will mentioned this, and this sort of echoes one of the comments in the Q&A, one of the real challenges for this is the cost and the complexity of the monitoring and the reporting and the verification. This is not a simple thing, right? Anything you do in the ocean, if you stimulate phytoplankton growth, how much carbon is actually removed from the atmosphere? What's the fate of that carbon? Whatever carbon is taken up won't stay where you for example, added iron or nitrogen. It's going to be moved by the ocean circulation. So you're going to have to use a combination of theory, field experiments, a lot of observational technologies and modeling to really track that carbon over long periods of time.
So, Will, there's one question in there about how would an entrepreneur interested in the space step into it? I wonder if you can give us some of the context behind that question, any sense you have of what's going on on the corporate side of things or on the commercial side of things?
Yeah, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of ocean CDR research and startups, at least tremendous compared to a few years ago. I'm on the Stripe oversight committee and also reviewed the X Prize proposals and have seen the Shopify list also. And there's a lot of startup companies that are looking at ocean-based approaches, everything from electrochemical approaches through ocean iron fertilization and other kinds of fertilization right beyond that. So I think one of the things that's important for a lot of them, based on proposals getting rejected because they aren't answering questions of how they're taking up regulatory requirements or how they're seeking to engage with potential stakeholders, are foundational questions. And I fear a lot of the startups are focused on the technology side, which is important and probably incumbent upon them given their limited resources, but not really getting any kind of consultation on the legal regulatory side or the public engagement side, and that's going to hurt them, I think, from a standpoint of getting investments in this context, given how controversial some of these propositions are, and also slow down rollout of these things if they're not starting to engage with pertinent agencies, EPA in the U.S., people like EPA or NOAA, for example. And I think a lot of people take the position, well, we'll do it and we'll ask for forgiveness later, right? I know a couple organizations that are doing that. It's a bad idea. It almost always begets backlash. Scott was referring to these ocean fertilization proposals from years ago for fish, for example, right? And there was, one entrepreneur that essentially said, you're not the boss of me, right? I'm just going to go out there and do that. And in my opinion, it led to responses that were fairly extreme, given what he was trying to do, but largely out of alarm that this was going to become, as Emily suggested, a Wild West, right? And so I think it's important to engage in that kind of work in parallel at the outset as a startup, even though it obviously is an expensive proposition, or otherwise it's just going to slow things down or ultimately scupper this because people are afraid that that it's not going to be subject to regulation.
Emily.
Yeah, so I was invited to be on the review panel for the X Prize submissions, and I actually withdrew because there was nothing in there. There was nothing in the bid call about social considerations. They weren't required to input any information on this. And so I withdrew because I was like, well, this is outside of my expertise. Like, I can't contribute anything here. But I think that's really importantly underlines the point that Will's just been making. Is you can't just judge these things on their technological characteristics alone, because we know that that leads to all kinds of unintended consequences further down the line. So we've been doing work on something that we're calling perception spillover, right, which is basically where you get a big controversy that kicks off in one area over one specific technique, often in one specific context. But what it then does is it has really big kind of psychological impact on the way in which people respond to other novel techniques further down the line. So the case study we've been using is fracking, which is slightly different from all of this, but it really illustrates the point that if you encounter, or if you create controversy in one particular area because you go for something and then just hope that you can apologize later, it's not just your sector that you're impacting by. And certainly in the case of fracking, we found that geothermal energy, which is completely different, is now encountering massive social risks because some people in the fracking sector did some things that they should not have done. So.
Yeah, one thing I'd want to add is a shout out to Stripe, who does require all of their applicants to discuss both social engagement issues and governance issues. And also, I think it's important for entrepreneurs to remember that regulation, it shouldn't always be reviewed as wholly restrictive. It also can be facilitative, right? If it provides you with the imprimatur of independent assessment of the merits of what you're doing, it's going to help down the road in terms of getting permits more quickly, and it's going to help you get investments more quickly. And so, you know, I get the frustration sometimes of having to go through a process that's often slow, especially in these early days of carbon removal. But in the long term, I think it will provide a foundation that facilitates these things much more quickly and will sort out the hucksters from the folks that are really doing good work. And we need that to happen quickly.
Well, and even, I mean, I think most people in this space are well-intentioned. And I think, you know, there are lots of things, whether it's coming from the scientific community or entrepreneurs, some of them aren't going to work out. And we need to find that out. And so it's not just, you know, that people might have, you know, bad, not even the right word, but a lot of this is trying to shake out and figure out on a relatively short time frame what could be used to scale up to potentially a large scale. You know, I mentioned at the beginning, human emissions are about 35 billion tons of CO2. Many of the climate scenarios that are being used by the IPCC and by the UN Conference of the Parties suggest that we would need something like 10 billion tons of CDR by mid-century. That is an enormous, so we're looking at something like a third of our current emissions of carbon dioxide from coal, natural gas, and oil. Now, no single technology is going to get there, but to be relevant, you're talking about something that's on the order of, you know, we sort of set a cutoff of something like 1/10 of a billion ton. You know, if you're below that, you know, and a global scalability, it's probably a niche, but not part of a global solution. But even 1/10 of a billion tons of CO2 per year is a big industry. I did want to address one of the questions in the Q&A that had to do with funding. And so there's sort of the funding for this research and development stage, and then there would be funding for deployment, and then, you know, scaling up that. You know, we mostly focused on funding mechanisms to do the research and development, which doesn't necessarily have to be all government funding, as Will mentioned. Stripe and other people from the commercial sector are quite interested in this. As you move forward for deployment, most of these, we did focus a lot on cost estimates, and that's another area that needs a lot of work. The current cost estimates are often very crude. But most of these technologies, unlike some of the mitigation, some of the things you can do on the carbon mitigation side and abatement, you reduce carbon emissions and you also use energy more efficiently, and it's a win-win on a monetary side, right? You can, house insulation is a classic example, or switching to LED lights is, you use less energy and it gains society money. Most of these ocean-based CDRs, there are potential for co-benefits, and we do talk about co-benefits. And for example, ecosystem restoration, which is both an ocean but also a coastal, as you go into salt marshes and mangroves and things, the co-benefits might actually be the driving factor. And so you might be doing this and get a benefit from the carbon sequestration, but the main reason is the co-benefits. We did look a little bit about market incentives, and there is some effort, but because of most of in most of these cases, it requires either a lot of energy or a lot of materials, or for example, the seaweed aquaculture for macroalgae, you're not using the macroalgae for biofuels or for food or agricultural supplies, you're actually burying it. There's not as many market incentives. So the funding will eventually for deployment would have to come from, either some sort of carbon policy or a price on carbon, and how that's distributed and done as a policy is sort of beyond the scope, but certainly part of a broader discussion of, social equity and who actually would pay for these activities.
And so, Emily, if we can pick up on social equity as a notion, you made some comments that are revealing about how the report deals with issues of inclusion and social equity. Can you give us some more from your own research and background? I'll give you a hypothetical. If a company was looking to do this right, how would they start in terms of social engagement and having equity and inclusion at the heart of the work?
Yeah, sure. Wow, that's a really big question. It's a really big question with a simple answer and a complicated answer. So I mean, listen is something that is very simple in theory, but a lot harder in practice. We've kind of been doing a lot of work around this idea of responsible innovation, which I guess this is really a question on. And so, you have to include people, you have to try and anticipate what your impact of your technique is going to be. You have to make sure that you give people a voice, but then you also have to respond to that voice. And that is something that's really, really difficult. And I can't name a single project, commercial or academic or otherwise, that I can really say has done this really well, right? And so it's an ongoing challenge. And you have to give people a genuine voice, because we know that if you give people what we call like a pseudo voice, in some cases that can actually be worse than giving people no voice at all, right? And so you have to make sure that it's not just about like, oh, you have a working group that's got like some inclusivity on it, and then that working group kind of come up with some recommendations, and then those recommendations kind of go into a drawer somewhere, and somebody says, oh, we're taking them into consideration, and there's no like visible impact of that. You know what I mean? There has to be a clear process baked in from the start about what you're actually going to do with what these people are telling you, right? Because that's how you give people a meaningful voice. I mean, beyond that as well, I think I'll say, as I mentioned in the thing, our cultural understanding of this stuff is like at nil. Basically, we've got some, as Scott pointed out, we've got some like vague ideas from the very few papers that there are on this topic. but we don't have any proper understanding of how people might actually respond to marine carbon removal. We don't have any proper understanding of how you would do this in a socially and environmentally just manner. We can take some analogues from previous techniques and we use them as best we can, but we always have to accept that, you know, an analog is just an analog, like it's only a proxy, and there's no substitute for actual empirical research. So it's almost like we kind of need to do this research, but we also need to do it quite quickly, because obviously the field is advancing very, very fast, and we need to get it in there as early as possible. And as I said at the end, you know, it just needs to be properly resourced. It shouldn't be a sort of side consideration in a project where you kind of devote a few £1,000s to it and think that that has been done. You know, you need capacity building. Capacity building costs money.
Yeah, one thing I'd add in that context is one of the good news things of this is you now have some projects that are incorporating this into their work, and we should start getting some lessons learned. I know Emily, for example, has worked some with Project Vesta, for example, which is engaged in some public stakeholder projects, and there's a consortium of foundations that are just about to fund a pretty large Native American stakeholder engagement project on the in the Northwest, and that should help us both in terms of looking at some of the cultural aspects and developing the architecture and seeing what works and doesn't work. So at least there's some practical things happening beyond journal articles at this point. But I concur with Emily. We've got, and Scott, right? We've got to go a lot more quickly, unfortunately, given where we've put ourselves in terms of climate.
So a few minutes left, Scott. In terms of next steps, what's hoped for now that the report has landed?
Yeah, so, well, we've been doing a lot of, as I said, we've been doing a lot of briefings for private funders, for foundations, for the public, and for federal agencies. On the, at least in the US, you know, the sort of next steps are to see if, you know, either at a administration-wide level or at individual agencies, how this gets picked up. Because eventually this, you know, there are lots of budget, there's lots of things that can be budgeted and spent within the federal research agencies. And so this will have to compete for those resources. I think in terms of particularly some of the entrepreneurial work and some of the commercially funded work, I'd really like to see somebody put up the funding to support a strong investment in a research code of conduct. You know, neither, you know, we could outline what was needed, but we had a pretty large task, and we weren't specifically on the research code of conduct. The Aspen Institute, I think, did a good stab at sort of the elements of it, but I think we need to start developing that and engaging the stakeholder groups as part of that process, and develop models of how you would do that public engagement early on. And you mentioned some of the efforts by some of the private funders, but to me that's pretty crucial. It's yes, we need to do electrochemical work, and we need to do lots of monitoring and verification and build out robotic systems and observing systems. But I think if we don't invest in sort of that social engagement side early on, and a strong commitment to transparency and monitoring and reporting and verification, this won't gain public traction.
10 seconds or so, Will or Emily, for any final thoughts?
You want to go, Emily?
Oh, I think Scott just said it basically. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree. We're going to have to do all of these simultaneously, and that's daunting given the resources that we have. But unchecked climate change is daunting too. So if this potentially has a role within limits, we should be putting some funding, including government funding, in place to see what the potential of this is. And if it turns out to be small, again, it reemphasizes the need for interventions more aggressively in other contexts, right? And it's better to know that now than later.
Thanks. Okay, hey Scott, Will, Emily, great to spend some time with you. Thank you all. Just a reminder that this webinar has been recorded. A captioned version will be available on our website in a few days. The website is carbonremoval.info. See you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.